Hello, everybody, and welcome to our presentation. We're proud to present Brian Floody this evening, talking about his father, Wally Floody, and The Great Escape. We are letting people in. There might be a few stragglers, but hopefully everybody is in. And for best results for the presentation, you should click on Speaker View. And your audio and possibly your video will be muted for the duration of the presentation. Certainly you should turn off your audio so we don't have any extraneous sound. At the end of our presentation, we will have a short question and answer, and you'll be able to type in questions using the chat function. My name is Glenn Chadwick, and I'm the program coordinator for the Beach and East Toronto Historical Society. If you give me a minute, I am admitting a few more people here. I have a pretty large crowd tonight. I do have a few announcements that I'd like to mention. Our historical society, the Beach and East Toronto Historical Society, is commencing its annual membership drive for 2021, and it is $20 per year to be a member. And you will be supporting our society's efforts, our website, and these kinds of historical talks and presentations. Normally we would have them live and in person, but obviously due to the COVID situation, we have gone online. We're also looking for people to become involved with the society, helping with research, being part of committees, of course, technical help, our website, and also serving on the board of directors. For more information, we'd like you to get in touch with us through our website, and the website is at the bottom of the screen here, www.tbeths.com, and that's the Beach and East Toronto Historical Society. I'm sure many of you already are members and are familiar with our organization. I'm just letting some more people in. We're up to 63 participants. So right now I'd like to begin our presentation, and I want to welcome a fellow beacher, Brian Floody, who is going to talk about his father's role in The Great Escape, which I'm sure everybody is familiar with from the movie and a multitude of books that have been made about the story. Thanks very much, and Brian, you can take over.
Okay, hi everybody. Hope you can see me all right and hear me all right. Let me just say thank you for inviting me to talk, and I'm a beacher, as Glenn said. I'm happy to present to the Beach and East Toronto Historical Society. My father was not from the Beach originally. He moved us here after the war, but certainly the family settled in as beachers. I went to Courcelette Road Public School and to Malvern, and along with my brother, and we paddled for the Bombing Beach Canoe Club, and I was a lifeguard at Ludy Beach. And my kids went to Bombing Beach and to Glen Ames and to Malvern as well. So we're certainly installed now. I'd like to start up now with this slideshow that I've prepared, and I'll be leaving a little time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. So if you got something you want to ask me, I have no idea if I'll know the answer, but I'll do it then. I'm still seeing lots of people and faces, so I'm assuming that once I start this show up, it'll allow me to go right to my slides. So we'll do that now. All right, let me start here. So this is about my dad and the Great Escape. You can see the picture of the old prisoner of war camp, Stalag Luft III there. and my father in his prisoner of war days, and of course the movie, The Great Escape, which I'll talk a little bit about too, since my dad had something to do with that. A brief outline, I'm going to talk about the history of The Great Escape, but quite briefly, because I'm assuming that most of you will know something about The Great Escape, even if it's just from the movie or whatever. And there's certainly a lot of material, so I can't do more than just briefly scan it. I'll talk about my father's role in The Great Escape, and I'll also talk about his role in making the movie. He was, some of you may not know that he was the technical advisor for the movie. We'll talk a little bit about an ongoing controversy, but certainly more so at the time, of Hollywood versus reality. And then I'll finish with talking, I had the good fortune to be able to attend the 75th anniversary and memorial for The Great Escape at the location of The Great Escape in Zagan, Poland 2 years ago. And then I've listed some resources and some a bibliography of sorts and that sort of thing at the end, which if you want to have a look at, then I won't go through them in any detail. You can certainly come back in a week or so and look at the recording and take your time and look at those slides. So let me start up here. The short description is The Great Escape was a massive escape of Allied airmen from Stalag Luft III. It was a prisoner of war camp during World War II. It took place on the night of March the 24th, 1944. So tomorrow is the 77th anniversary of the escape. The planning and preparation for the escape took more than a year and included almost 600 men. In 1950, ex-prisoner of war Paul Brickhill published his memoir, The Great Escape. And there have been many more books written about it since then, and several documentary films made over the years. But the escape was best popularized by the Hollywood movie, The Great Escape, which was released in 1963. Just as an icebreaker here, I can't quite see the whole screen here, but I'll give you a little bit of slang that was common in the prisoner of war camps. They referred to themselves as Kriegies, short from Kriegsgefangenen. And I'm sorry for my pronunciation to my grade 10 German teacher, Mr. Zwerg. I'm sure he's spinning in his grave. Goons were what they generally called the German guards, and a goon box was a sentry tower. Ferrets were a special type of guard, German soldiers, and they were trained to discover escape activity. Stooges were the opposite to them. They were the prisoner of war security men who were responsible for keeping the escape activities secret. Penguins were people that dispersed the sand that came up from the tunnels. And we'll talk more about that later. The sand underneath the compound, the Stalag Luft III, was black on the surface because it was part of a pine forest. And the first 2 or 3 feet maybe, or less than that, sometimes inches, were black, but everything below that was a gold yellow. And as soon as anybody saw it up top, it would indicate that there was tunneling going on. So getting rid of that sand was a major problem, and the penguins were one of the solutions. I'll talk about it in a little while. A hard arser. A hard arser was an escaper who traveled overland. And these were the guys that they didn't speak any other language usually, and they weren't given a whole lot of chance to get away. They were going to try to walk to the border and get themselves across. They had a minimal, they had rations and maps and compasses, but not much else. The circuit was an area just inside the warning wire, and I'll talk about that in a second. And it was often where prisoners would walk. It was like sort of the warning track around a football field. And they walked there for exercise and for socializing, but they also did it to avoid being overheard. It was obviously that there were ferrets were in there trying to get information about tunneling or escape attempts, and nobody really did too much talking indoors because it was too easy to bug it or to have somebody listening. The cooler, those of you who've seen the movie know that that's the solitary confinement cell block that Hiltz ends up in, sort of throwing his baseball. So this is Stalag Luft III, the layout of it. It was so-called escape-proof prisoner war camp. And it was where they decided to put all of their bad apples, if I can say that. They moved in 1943 a lot of escapers that had been in other camps into Stalag Luft III because they figured that they'd made it so difficult to be able to get out of. It was about 200, and the site of it's still 200 kilometers southeast of Berlin in the Silesian forest in what's now Poland. The North Compound, which is what you're looking at, was opened in April 1943. There was eventually 6 compounds holding more than 10,000 men. The compound was 300 yards square, 2 barbed wire fences about 10 feet high, several feet apart, and barbed wire between the 2 of them. There was a warning wire about 30 feet inside the inner fence, and it was about 2 feet high. And you could walk inside that warning wire, but if you stepped over it, you were likely to get shot. The sentry towers or goon boxes were along the perimeter about every 100 yards. And the North Compound had about 15 huts with 18 rooms each, and it held just under 1,000 men at the time of the escape. Now, the escape-proof elements of this camp, the Germans had learned a lot from their experiences trying to look after Allied prisoners for the first few years of the war. And Stalag Luft was supposed to contain, as I said, the prisoners that had the worst records. It was situated hundreds of miles from the sea and from any Western borders or neutral country borders. So even if you got out of the camp, it was going to be a major job simply to get out of Germany itself to some kind of safety. It was built on sandy soil, which made tunneling very difficult. And I've talked a little bit about that, and I'll talk more about it. They buried microphones in the soil to detect any sound of tunneling. And that was one of the reasons that the Great Escape tunnels had to be dug so deep. They were 30 feet down. The huts were built on concrete blocks 4 or 5 feet above ground so that the guards could check under them for tunneling activity. And there was a corps of ferrets, who were especially trained to recognize signs of escape activity. And they were especially active in Stalag Luft III. Now, there's many attempts at escape from prisoner war camps in the Second World War, but the Great Escape sets itself apart because of the enormous scale. It was, and also because it was from this Stalag Luft III was an escape-proof camp. And I'll show you a little video here that gives you some idea of it.
Despite these obstacles, it was from Stalag Luft III that the infamous Great Escape was attempted. A daring breakout planned by an escape organization of more than 600 men. Engineers building 3 massive tunnels 30 feet deep with underground workshops and railways. An ingenious network of forgers, map makers, compass makers, tailors, machinists, and security and intelligence operatives. The Great Escape was immortalized in the 1963 film, but the reality of the escape was even more dramatic than any Hollywood scriptwriter could imagine.
The real astonishment, to my mind, was not that it was done, but that it was possible to do it without the Germans discovering it.
Ironically, Stalag Luft III would prove to be the perfect environment for an escape organization to thrive.
So the man you saw talking there was Dick Churchill. He was a great escaper, and he was the last one alive who was actually in the escape and actually went through the tunnel. And he died, I think, in 2019 at about 99 years of age, and one of the few to go through the tunnel and survive. All right, let me show a little bit more about this. This man you're looking at is Roger Bushell. He was the heart and soul of the Great Escape. He was designated Big X, which was the leader of the X organization, which was created to control escapes and escaping within the camp. And he was the real visionary behind having this large escape, on the scale that it was. He planned to dig 3 tunnels, Tom, Dick, and Harry. They were each given a common name, so no one would ever overhear anybody saying the word tunnel. That was verboten. You couldn't say that at all. He figured if one was found, then they'd be able to use another one, you know. So, and this was a brand new outlook to escaping. And there'd been many tunnels dug from many prison camps before this. Bushell's escape plan was to set 250 prisoner of war free into the heart of Germany to disrupt the German war effort and hopefully get some people back back home, back to Britain.
More importantly, it would hurt the German war effort.
Canadians were probably, after the British, the single largest representation in the escape organization.
Bushell set up a corporation. Its business, escaping. He was the CEO and called himself Big X. Below him were department heads. Forgery, security, intelligence, travel, and most important of all, tunneling. The head of the tunnel team was a Canadian mining engineer from Northern Ontario, Wally Floody.
A lot of the people who were diggers, tunnelers, had pre-war mining experience. So Floody was responsible for the engineering aspects of the operation.
This man is Jonathan Vance, no relation to the current celebrity or maybe notoriety. He is a historian from the University of Western Ontario, and he wrote books early in the 60s. He's one of the first to sort of document the Great Escape. So here's my dad. He was an RCAF fighter pilot who flew Spitfires in 401 Squadron out of Biggin Hill in southern England, and he was shot down in 1941. Here he is before going overseas, and here he is later on in prison camp. He certainly looks a little scruffier. You forget how young these guys were. I think the first picture he's 21 years old, and maybe 23 and 24 in the second ones. So these were a lot of, you know, young men in this camp, and sometimes you forget that when you hear about all the stuff that they accomplished and did. So here's a picture of Harry. Now, Harry was the tunnel that was eventually used for the Great Escape. And this is a sort of a sectional drawing, and it gives you some idea of the size. It was more than 350 feet long, and it was 30 feet deep. To get below, you can see, I think number 16 is the microphones, and you can see how much was down there. There's 3 rooms at the bottom of the shaft. One was for accumulating the sand that was dug out of the tunnel. I think my father told me once that for every 3 feet he dug forward in a 2 foot by 2 foot tunnel, it produced a ton of sand. And this was the yellow sand that had to be dispersed in secret because it would stand out so obviously on the surface. There was also a workroom there where people were making equipment and repairing stuff. And there was underneath the tunnel itself, there was duct working to pump air into the tunnel. Very difficult to get enough air in there to breathe unless somebody pumped it all the time. So there was always somebody in there on that pump. You can see the railway that was created, the little running carts from beginning to end of the tunnel. Underneath that first part, number 7, I think, is the air pipeline that was buried in the floor and went up through the stove and through the chimney and brought in fresh air. A little bit of the sort of glibness of the British sense of humor. The way stations were named, the first one Piccadilly and the second one Leicester Square, a little homage, of course, to those tube stops in London. So here's a picture of my dad and 3 of the other, these are all Canadians, although I think only three are tunnelers. My father's on the front left, and up behind him is Scruffy Weir, who was a tunneler who usually worked with my father, and also Hank Birkeland. He's called Big Train, and he was murdered. He was one of the 50 who were murdered at the end. So here's the entrance underneath this stove. And the drawings here are drawn by somebody named Lee Kenyon. And he did the illustrations for Paul Brickhill's book, The Great Escape. And he also Roger Bushell has set him as the documenter of the escape activities, and Brickhill the same for the written word. The trap door under this was just extraordinary. It was so well hidden, looking right at it, you had no clue. And even in the wintertime, the stove had to be lifted off and repiped so it wouldn't interrupt the smoke going up the chimney. And the purpose of it was that it could be done quickly, because if the lookout saw somebody coming, saw a German on his way toward the hut, they would have to seal this trap up and put the stove back in operational order in less than a minute. So it was quite an amazing feat of engineering. The tunnelers here look like they've got a little bit more room than they actually did. My shoulders are about 20 inches wide, and this is 24 inches wide and tall. So, I've got about 2 inches on either side of me. My father was a bigger man than I am. I'm 6'2" and he was 6'4". So this picture, although it shows the elements of it very well, is a little bit generous when it comes to the size. The size of the tunnel was dictated by the shoring. The wood shoring was needed because of the sand that was not very sustainable. It would collapse. So they shored the whole tunnel up. And the only thing they really had to do it with was bedboards, and the bunks were 2 feet wide. So this is pretty much set the size of the tunnel at 2 feet by 2 feet. So here's the pump. They call them kit bags in Britain, but they were made out of duffel bags, a military issue. And they were, this pumped the air from above down through the ductwork that was made out of Klim cans. And I'll show you one if you, at the end, if we got some time. And they were powdered milk cans that came in Red Cross parcels. And you can see after the escape, this is one of the ferrets, a guy named Rubberneck, that was very unpopular with the POWs, as you can imagine. These are Klim cans, and they're from Red Cross parcels, and they had many uses and a variety of tools, both for use in the tunnel and also just general use around for cooking and things like that could be made out of these cans, and they were used to make the air ducts that went through the tunnels. So this is Harry again, photographed the tunnel shaft, taken of course after the escape, and also Lee Kenyon's drawings of the tunnelers. And you can see again, he's fairly generous with the size. You could never really get a picture of the cart plus somebody's face like that because there just wasn't enough room in the tunnels. Here's another drawing by Lee Kenyon, and this is in Harry's entrance in 104, Hut 104. And you can see the lookout in the back there, keeping a watchful eye. You can see the bedboards that are about to be taken down, and the wood that held the stove. The stove's been lifted off, and the tunnelers, tunneling, they were done generally with no clothes on or with pajamas, silk pajamas on that they got from home, because if any sand came up with them or was seen on them or on their clothing, that would be a dead giveaway to the ferrets that people were tunneling. So here are the penguins. This is the German ferret, sort of demonstrating how they worked after the escape. And David McCallum in the movie was a penguin, and penguins, their job was to disperse the sand, and they would put it in these bags, usually made from towels, and hang it around their neck. And they would walk out with sand and walk in onto the playing fields or into the gardens and dump the sand, and it would be sort of raked into the sort of topsoil. Now the sand was disposed of in many other ways. It was hidden behind walls, and there was a theater built later on, and it was a lot of it was put there. But these were one of the more common ways to get rid of all this sand that was being generated by these massive tunnel efforts. Again, the other problem was cave-ins. You know, sand is not structurally sound, so you had to shore up the tunnel the whole way. And sometimes if you got a little too far out in front when you're digging, you would be get in trouble. And my father was buried several times, a couple of times quite seriously. And here's his digging partner, Scruffy Weir, talking a little bit about that.
But once the actual tunnels were under construction, the soft, sandy earth created another problem. The underground passageways were prone to cave-ins.
Sand has no support. You dig out and it's just a matter of time till it'll collapse. Wally was digging and I was passing back. And suddenly the candle blew out and there was a hell of a wind in my face, so I knew damn well what it was. So I just went forward as fast as I could. And I got him out in about, well, I guess, minutes.
So while this tunneling was going on, there's many other preparations were being made, of course. There's a huge infrastructure that surrounded the digging of the tunnels. Security was the most paramount thing. There's about 300 men that acted as various lookouts, and they were, as soon as somebody came into the camp, a German guard or a ferret, somebody was put on them, somebody watched them. There was a whole series of complex signals set up to warn the diggers that maybe there was somebody coming in. Sometimes diversions had to be planned. So security was a big part of the whole enterprise, took a lot of people. Intelligence was another part. Guard postings had to be known and figured out, and their rotations logged, and local train schedules had to be acquired. They had to get a hold of documents, travel documents that were needed. All of this was done by the intelligence group. Scroungers were the people that got the various things by any possible way they could. They traded for them, they stole them, and made them if they could. But the scroungers often would befriend German guards, and they would get them to, they would give them bribes that they got from Red Cross parcels, chocolate and German, which were almost impossible to get in Germany too. So it was their job to come up with all of this stuff. And then of course it had to be hidden. Cameras, that sort of thing that was needed for documents. You can see an inventory list of the missing things that were, as my father used to say, liberated at the end of the presentation. And again, I won't go through it at any time, but you can look back at it. It was a huge amount of stuff. There was tailors to make civilian clothes out of old uniforms and blankets. There was forgers that created official IDs and travel documents, and they had to be stamped with the correct date. And that came up in the escape itself. There was problems going on with the escape. There was delays, and but they couldn't cancel it because all the documents had been stamped with March the 24th, and they had to use them on that date. Lee Kenyon, the artist, was a forger as well. There was manufacturing, digging tools had to be made, compasses, maps. They had to make high protein foodstuffs for the hard arses to carry. All that was happening in secret at the same time. Now, there were setbacks, of course. All of these activities were taking place for the better part of 1943 and early 1944 in complete secrecy under the very watchful eyes of German guards. Sometimes tight security wasn't enough, and in early September, the Germans began to suspect something was happening in Hut 123, and they made a concerted search and uncovered the trapdoor to Tom. Now, Tom had been the premier tunnel, and it was almost complete. The shaft to the surface was just about to be dug up. Its discovery was a terrible blow to the morale, and it also ended the chance of any American POWs to take part in the Great Escape, because they were moved out of the North Compound to their own compound, the South Compound, a week or two after Tom was found. and that was in the fall of 1943, and the escape was, of course, in March of 1944. On the night of the Great Escape, over 200 POWs were crammed into Hut 104, which is Harry's, the entrance to Harry, and they were waiting their turn to go down the tunnel. The first 25 to go were selected by Big X, and they were the senior operators in the Big X organization, the section heads and that sort of thing. And then after the first 25, everybody else picked a spot by lottery. Almost immediately, there was a series of delays that threw off the tunneling timetable, the escape timetable. The night was very cold for March, much colder than it is now here. There was snow on the ground, and it took time to dig through the frozen earth to the end of the tunnel, only to discover that it was 10 feet short of the woods. And then they had to send up a rope signal to be able to signal when the escapers could come out because there was guards patrolling along the inside or the outside of the wire fence. There was an air raid in the middle of the escape, and that cut off electricity to the camp and also to the tunnel, which was hooked up to 104's electricity, and it left them in complete darkness for over an hour. Here is again is Lee Kenyon's view of or depiction of the Harry coming up short in the woods and the rope that helped them escape. And of course, this was happening in snow, so any amount of disturbance was going to leave some sort of track. So they had to do everything as quickly as they could in the dark. Also that night, some of the escapers who'd never been down in the tunnel before became claustrophobic, and they panicked, causing minor cave-ins, sometimes trolley derailment. Somebody had to, so there was experienced tunnelers down there in the way stations and help them through and repair things that needed to be repaired. But eventually, just before dawn, the tunnel was discovered. A guard patrolling saw an escaper coming out of the tunnel, and he raised the alarm. 76 escapers got away, but most of them were recaptured within a few weeks. During the time, however, 100,000 German soldiers were diverted to search for the escapees, and this fulfilled one of the escape's major objectives, which was to disrupt the German war effort. When Hitler heard of the escape, he was furious, and he demanded the death of all of the recaptured escapers, but they decided on more than half, and it turned out to be 50. Now, my dad, Wally Floody, he missed the Great Escape. He got transferred 3 weeks before the escape with about 20 other POWs that had reputations as escapers. They were moved to another compound, and they missed the Great Escape. Now, although he was very bitter at the time, after the events that followed the escape, my father always believed that his removal from the North Compound almost certainly saved his life. And here again is a Lee Kenyon drawing of these key personnel being moved out of the camp. I think they were moved on the last day of February, so 3 weeks or so before the actual escape took place. Of the escapees, there were 76 men who actually got out of the tunnel, but only 3 made it back to England. 2 Norwegians, Jens Mueller and Piers Bergsland, they made it to the Baltic Sea, and they went by train, and then they were hidden in a Swedish ship by Swedish sailors that they'd met. And when the Germans finished doing their quick sweep of the ship before they let it sail, they were safely hidden and taken back to neutral Sweden. And they were back in England within a week. The third, a Dutchman named Bran van der Stok, made it to the Netherlands and then into France and down through France, across the Pyrenees to Spain and then to Gibraltar, and finally back to England. It took him 4 months. So there was quite a difference there, how successful they were. Now, of the 73 recaptured escapees, 50 were murdered by the Gestapo. And this was a huge shock to everybody. Even the Luftwaffe, who was their actual guards in Stalag Luft III, who had kind of they were all pilots, and the Luftwaffe officers had a certain gentleman's agreement kind of thing with escapers, because they were, up until that point, if you escaped, you were pretty much just taken back to the prison camp and put in the cooler for a couple of weeks maybe. But nobody thought of that they were ever going to be killed. And they were murdered by the Gestapo. And of course, this was the famous Sagan order, which was kept quiet even amongst the Germans because it was such a violation of the Geneva Convention. And it was said that they were shot trying to escape. But then when the list was given to the senior British officer, the first thing he asked was, well, how many were wounded? And when the answer was none of them, it became pretty clear that they were just outright murdered. So here's a monument built by the prisoners of war. It was near Stalag Luft III. They were allowed to go out and build this, and they were given the ashes of the 50, and they were entombed them here. And they stayed, eventually they were taken and put into a war cemetery, but this monument still stands in Poznan near Zagan in what's now Poland. So now let's start to talk a little bit about The Great Escape, the movie. Now this was made by, I'll stop this, I'm sure you all have heard this music before. This was done by John Sturges, and it was released in 1963, and it was a huge box office hit. But it wasn't that obvious initially. Sturges had a very hard time getting this movie made. He tried for about 10 years. He bought the rights from Paul Brickhill to the book, The Great Escape. And, you know, it was a little too close to the war. It was only 18 years after the end of the war. And, you know, the powers that be in the studio system didn't really think it was going to hit a little too close to home. And it wasn't until he made a movie and released a movie in 1961 called The Magnificent Seven, you know, based on Kurosawa's Seven Samurai. And that became a huge popular hit with Yul Brynner and several of the actors that were in this movie, The Great Escape. Steve McQueen and Charles Bronson was in it, and I think James Coburn was also in it. And that's what finally got the green light for The Great Escape, and he went ahead and started to make it in 1962. So he hired my father, Wally Floody, as a technical advisor for the movie, and I'll give you a little bit of a, if I can find my cursor there.
Conscious of Brickhill's concerns about accuracy, Sturges wanted his help on the design and layout of the camp.
He phoned Australia and asked Paul Brickhill to come, and Paul said, no, I've been sick, I can't possibly. He said, have you any suggestions? He said, yes, I can tell you exactly who to take. Go to Canada and get Wally Floody. He built the thing. He'll know more about it than anybody else.
During captivity in Stalag Luft III, Canadian airman Wally Floody had been responsible for the overall design and plan of the 3 escape tunnels. After the war, he had returned to his native country.
Floody had become an insurance executive in Canada. We made a deal with him to come over and spend 2 months with us, a month of preparation and the first month of shooting.
Wally sent for his logbook, and up behind Sturges on his desk, he had all the little authentic pictures of what Stalag Luft III that had come out of Wally's thing. Oh yes, he wanted it to be authentic very much.
With Wally Floody on board as technical advisor, the filmmakers set about building the notorious prison camp.
Some of you may recognize the voice of the narrator there. That was Burt Reynolds. So here's my dad with James Garner and John Sturges on set. There was a lot of conversations going on about how exactly things happened and that sort of stuff while Dad was working there. Here's the warning wire I was talking about earlier on, which sort of goes at about knee level around 30 feet inside of the outside fences that you weren't allowed to cross over. You could walk inside the wire, but not outside. Sturges was known for storyboarding his whole story, and he shot it pretty much straight up that way. He was also known from The Magnificent Seven as being a good ensemble director. So this is a little bit of my father's work on the tunnel.
The art department would take Wally and put him in the tunnel set, and he would literally say, you know, it's not tight enough, because I remember my shoulders, I haven't gained that much weight, my shoulders were scraping, so they'd take him out and take him back the next day after they adjusted it.
With Floody's reassurance, Sturgis and his team were confident that they were realistically recreating the events of the daring escape.
Wally said, you know, you guys are getting it right. The wire and the construction and the actors. He said, I know you're getting it right. And I said, are you sure? And he said, yeah, because I'm having nightmares.
So here is my father with Charles Bronson, of course, who portrayed him for the most part in the movie. He was the tunnel king, so-called because he was the main tunneler. And my father, of course, got to be called that after the movie was made too. Bronson was a composite character. You know, he was made up of 2 or 3 personalities of different tunnelers. He was in charge, so my father, but he was nothing like my father. My father, of course, wasn't Polish, and he wasn't claustrophobic, which Bronson was supposed to be in the film. And Bronson's about 5'7", and my father was 6'4", so there's a substantial difference between them. Here's the movie set, a large set, as you can see, with a large cast of extras out in front. Back in the days when you actually had to pay extras, there was no CGI or anything like that. Here's a couple more on-set photos at the railway station and up on the boom. I'll talk a little bit about the Hollywood versus reality. This had come up a lot at the time, because of course at the time there was a lot of people that knew people who'd been involved in the Great Escape, or a lot of people who'd been in the camp, and there was a lot of discussion about, oh, this was just, you know, American Hollywood going crazy and taking away a British story. But the pre-escape preparations were portrayed quite accurately. The major difference was ones of scale. I mean, everything was kind of shrunk down because they had to have an easy way of showing all the forgers working and make a more manageable depiction of it. But of course, in reality, there was more than 600 people working on it, 300 just in security. The individual characters were fictional composites, as I was saying. My dad was portrayed by Charles Bronson, who was Danny Walensky, but he wasn't Polish and he wasn't claustrophobic. And but there was other tunnels that were, and most of the characters were composite characters like that. Again, to make it smaller so that you were focusing on less people than there was, but also a lot of the people were still alive. Like I said, their families, and they didn't want people to say, oh, you know, my brother wasn't like that, or they didn't want to get into those kind of hassles. So they made these kind of fictional composite characters up. One exception was Roger Bushell. He was portrayed by Richard Attenborough as, they changed his name to Roger Bartlett, but he was straight on, was directly portrayed to be him. One of the biggest differences that upset the Great Escape purists was the inclusion of Americans in the escape. Of course, it's true that Americans didn't take part in the actual escape. Many of the Americans that participated in the operation, the preparations, and they were all moved, you know, after the discovery of Tom to a different compound. So few of them took part in the escape. Some actually did, but they were, you know, they were flying in the RAF or the Canadian Forces, Air Force. So it was, but it was a bone of contention because, of course, the major stars in the movie were all primarily Americans, you know, Coburg and, you know, Hiltz, you know, who was Steve McQueen, and of course, James Garner. Now, the biggest discrepancy, of course, between Hollywood and reality comes after the escape in the movie. And no one really knows exactly what happened to these guys because they were later murdered, but Hollywood writers took great license for the purpose of dramatic effect. And there was no, you know, Sturgis knew what he was about. I mean, was going to sell this to Americans, and he had to make it a lively actioner. And I just had a discussion with a bunch of prisoner of war children earlier this afternoon, and they were talking about how if this was a documentary, it would have been exceedingly boring. What made it such a high level hit was the fact that it was dramatically well done. Now I'm going to show you a few short clips of the movie, and I want you to sort of guess to yourself which ones you think are factually correct and which ones are Hollywood inventions. So here's the first one. Now, this is the famous Hiltz motorcycle jump. So in case some of you are wondering, Steve McQueen didn't do that jump. It was done by a stunt double, Bud Atkins. There was a lot of talk at the time that he had done it, and he'd actually developed this part of the escape himself. Nothing like being a star. You can call your own shots. And he did a lot of the riding. He was actually an excellent motorcyclist. I mean, he raced in many races and in cars as well as motorcycles. The bike itself is a Triumph that's kind of made up to look a little bit like a BMW. He was a fan of Triumph bikes. And he rode most of the scenes in the movie, other than the jump, were ridden by him. And in fact, he did some of the riding for the German guard that was following him. But when it came to the jump, you know, the insurance company sort of said, nah, I don't think so. You know, our $1 million star is going to jump a motorcycle off some barbed wire. So they nixed that, and they had to use a stunt double, who was an old buddy, by the way, no pun on his name, of Steve McQueen's. And he came over from California and did the jump. So here's the second of these little scenes. This is Danny the Tunnel King's escape by ship to Sweden. So the third scene is Roger Bartlett in the movie Roger Bushell's capture after the escape.
Geheime Staatspolizei, Ihren Ausweis bitte. Ah, français. Jawohl. Commençons. Oui. Parlez-vous français? Un peu. Votre accent est très bon. Oh, je l'ai tout fait dans l'école supérieure. Eh bien, passez. Si. Au revoir, monsieur. Au revoir. Good luck. Thank you.
And the last one is, oh, there we are, the execution of the 50.
Was ist los? Wo sind wir? All right, you can get out now. Stretch your legs for 5 minutes. It'll take hours before you reach the camp. You know, Meg, all this, the organization, tunneling, Tom and Harry, kept me alive. Even though I've never been happier. You know, Meg,
So here again are the the four, and I'm not sure how you guessed, but I think most of you know that Hiltz's attempted escape by motorcycle was pure Hollywood fantasy. Even the character of Hiltz wasn't based on anybody in particular, and there was no American that did the sort of things that he did. The second one, the escape of Danny the Tunnel King by ship to Sweden, well, we know that 2 Norwegians did get away pretty much this way. They didn't actually row out to the boat, but they were hidden on a Swedish ship, and they made it to Sweden. It wasn't Danny the Tunnel King. My father didn't make it out of the escape. So it was partly factual and partly fictionalized. The capture of Roger Bushell, this is factual. This is pretty much what happened. They were stopped by the police, and Roger was traveling with his travel mate, a man named Bernard Schönhauer, and they asked him something in English, good luck, and he responded in English, sort of an old trick, and it tipped them to the police, and that's how they got caught, and they were both shot, murdered as part of the 50. Number 4 is the execution of the 50, and this is factual. Of course, 50 people were killed, 50 POWs, but they were actually murdered in groups of 1 or 2 or 3, being driven in automobiles in various different parts of Germany, being told they were taken back to the camp, and shot in the back of the head, as opposed to that mass execution that the movie shows. Here's my father again with the 2 main stars. My father wasn't much of a fanboy. He didn't go to the movies much, and he didn't really know a lot about these guys. My mother, on the other hand, loved James Garner. She just thought he was the best thing. And he actually signed this, but she'd gone over with my dad for a part of the time, and she was thrilled to meet him. My father was actually more impressed by the technical people. He thought they were tremendous. They could do all kinds of things that amazed him. Now, just as a little aside, as we get to the end here, all the POWs in the Great Escape, of course, are dead. And even most of the actors that portrayed them have died. One notable exception is David McCallum. He's Ashley Pitt in the movie in 1963. And he's still working as Ducky in NCIS as late as last year. I think he's, comes in for the occasional show now, but he had a long and storied career. He was Ilya Kuryakin in The Man from U.N.C.L.E., and he had a tremendous life as an actor. Now, this is shots of the camp that I took 2 years ago. I was lucky enough to be there for the 75th anniversary. Tomorrow will be the 77th. There's nothing left really of the camp anymore. It's all, there's a few foundations, and the woods have come back to take over. There's a small museum not too far away, but what they do have is the tunnel Harry is depicted on the surface by a walkway that you sort of see here with the, and that part of it is marbled with the inscriptions of the people that got out, the 76 escapers that got out, and they're broken down by their country. We're looking at the Canadian one here, of course, in Polish. The people in blue are the people that made it back home, and the people in black were part of the 50. That was actually a lovely memorial to go to. Many people there from various military organizations and from the ex-prisoner of war associations in several countries. There was, I think, 10 or 11 different nationalities represented in the men that died. And they laid wreaths at the exit to Harry. And on the other side, you see the marching of the Polish airmen, and each one of them had a picture of one of the 50, and they would march by this parade stand, and they had a gun salute, and there was a flight overhead of British Air Force planes and Polish Air Force planes. It's actually well done. This is a picture I have called the 50. It was a Stalag Luft III, the Tunnel Martyrs, it's called. And it's just a series of scenes taken from camp life and war life, but around the picture are the pictures of the 50 who were murdered, and several of whom have children that I've met or know. Okay, so those of you who are still have a little bit more interest in this, I'll give you some resources here. There is a mock-up of Harry in the National Air Force Museum in Trenton. So if you're ever down that way, it's worth going to see. It's to size scale of at least the down shaft and the beginning of the tunnel of the Great Escape. Here's a bunch of books that I used, the primary ones being Paul Brickhill's original The Great Escape and Ted Barris's fairly new Canadian story of The Great Escape. But there's Barbara Hayner wrote a book about my father specifically in 2004. And many of these other men were actual POWs, and this is their memoirs. On the video side of it, of course, the film The Great Escape by John Sturges. And there's a bunch of documentaries. I won't go through them all, but many of them you can find now on YouTube, and there's many more available if you have an interest. Oh, this is the inventory I was telling you about of all the things that were sort of stolen to support the tunnels. Again, I won't read through it. You can go and have a look at it if you want to go back in a week or so when the recording of this is up and have a look. It's quite interesting. Okay, well, if we got some time here, I'll turn it over. We'll do some Q&A here. So I guess I'll stop share.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, Brian, I'm gonna just first of all thank you for your presentation at this point, and we are going to have a little time for a Q&A, a question and answer. What we would like people to do is to not unmute yourself, but to go to the share button. I believe it's at the bottom of the screen, and type in your questions that you would like Brian to.
Sorry, Glenn, it's the chat button.
Sorry?
The chat button.
Oh, chat button, yes. I knew it was four letters, but.
Thank you, David.
Okay, thanks, David. He's our technical advisor behind the scenes here. He's helping us with any little idiosyncrasies that we might have. Before we do that, I do want to mention a couple of things about our society. And for anybody who's interested, we have a website that is www.tbeths.com. And that's where you can contact us if you'd like to get involved with the society in any capacity at all. And also if you would like to become a member and support our efforts at Heritage in the Beach and East Toronto. I believe I will be doing the reading of the questions to Brian. So I'm going to just go and look for the first question here, and I have to put my glasses on for that. So
I thought I was going to do this part, Glenn.
Yeah, can you read the questions?
Yeah.
Okay, so David is going to read the questions. That'll take me off the hook. And I guess we would probably go till approximately 8:30 or so, unless we run out of questions.
Yeah.
And again, if you
or I run out of answers,
or you run out of answers, that's great.
Oh, I don't think that's going to happen, Brian.
Yeah.
Well, the very first question is one that occurred to me as well, so I'm anxious to hear this one. Jules was impressed with the list of the inventory, and the question is, how come the guards didn't notice so many things missing, in particular the bunk beds and the boards from the beds?
Well, that is a good question, and to some degree, the beds were made up, or people were on them every time they came near them. But it was depicted in the movie, 2 or 3 times somebody would jump on a bed and would break. There would only be about a third of the boards left in the bed, and they would crash right through into the next bed. So it was a little bit dicey going, but pretty much they kept the Germans away from them, or they ran interference of some form or another to keep them from finding out. And eventually, of course, one of the reasons they found Tom was they found sand, and that was due to the fact that wood was disappearing.
Yeah. Another question that I also thought of: if the huts were 4 or 5 feet, this is from Michael Hogan. If the huts were 4 or 5 feet off the ground, how did they get from the floor of the hut to the start of the down shaft unseen?
Yeah, that's a good question. The answer to that is that not the whole hut was off the ground. I mean, some parts of it, the parts that had something like the stove, something that was a fire hazard, were built on concrete pads, and they cut through the concrete pads. Things like the showers and the bathrooms were also built partially on concrete pads because the plumbing had to go down through them to get itself underground. So those were the areas that they, of course, had to use. They just had to be very, very careful in how they disguised the traps. And there was somebody watching those traps all the time to make sure that they weren't found. The so-called trap Führers, whose job it was to watch the trap anytime somebody was down below.
Yeah, when you were talking about the inventory and the scroungers, I quickly remembered Hogan's Heroes, and they did a lot of scrounging. And Clyde has a question: how did they obtain the electrical wire?
Well, the electrical wire was got at the last minute. Clyde, how are you? And it was somebody coming in from outside the camp. One of the Kriegies had been out into a prison camp, and there was a work crew in there, and they left a bunch of wire, and he just picked it up and stole it. So they had 300 or 400 meters of this wire that he'd managed to get. But that's one of the reasons that they couldn't electrify the tunnel for lights earlier. They did it within a few months of the actual escape. Up until then, they used kind of margarine candles with sort of a pajama cord or shoelace wicks. It's pretty primitive stuff. It was pretty dark and horrible down in those tunnels.
I didn't scroll down far enough to see that Jules also anticipated my thought about Hogan's Heroes, and there were several prison camp movies and stories around. I remember there was one. Stalag 17 was another one, wasn't it?
Yeah, some of them were serious, and some of them were comedies like Hogan's Heroes. I know that I just heard Chris Pangelli, who was his father, Tony, was a prisoner of war, and when his father came home, he couldn't he couldn't watch the movie, but he could watch Hogan's Heroes because it was funny. The movie brought back too many harsh realities,
Yeah. Apparently, there was a prisoner named Davy Jones. Can you tell us anything about him?
Sure, Davy Tokyo Jones. He was an amazing character. He was a friend of my dad's, and he was American. He was in the American Air Force, and he was famous before he even got to Stalag Luft III because he'd flown in the Doolittle raid, over Tokyo, 30 seconds over Tokyo. He'd already made that flight, and then he got shot down again over North Africa and sent to Stalag Luft III, and became a digger, the primary digger in Harry before Tom was discovered. But he was an American, and he was shipped out to the South Compound after that. But he was a well-known, lifelong Air Force guy, and he was the general in charge of Cape Canaveral. And when my brother stopped in to see him one time when we were younger men, he took him through the whole outfit there, and he and my dad were friends their whole lives.
Wow. Barbara is asking if your father had any connection to the Great Escape restaurant on Queen that operated in the 1980s.
No, No, he didn't, or to the Great Escape bookstore on Kingston Road. He knew of them, of course, but you know, he didn't, wasn't connected to them in any way.
We have Major Harwood with us tonight, and he's asking, he says, wonderful presentation, thank you. How will you remember the fallen on the 77th anniversary tomorrow?
Well, you know, on the day of the last year or 2 years ago, I went to the thing at the memorial in Poland. I happened to be in Europe at the time. It was great. We never made, my father never really made much of a fuss of it at the time. You know, we spent time on November the 11th, but nothing specific to those men. I think it was a little bit hard for my father, really. I don't know if it was survivor's guilt, but I knew he was upset thinking about those 50. And never really wanted to be centered out. He wouldn't let his name be put on the movie. He refused to go to King George to get it decorated. It was mailed to him. So it was a quiet day. There was nothing. My father didn't really talk about the Great Escape very much. I mean, it became a central part of our lives because so many family friends were POWs or ex-POWs. And we would always get together every few years, even when we were kids up at Pappy Elliott's farm, that sort of thing, for a big picnic. And he went to many, you know, for lack of a better word, conventions of the ex-prisoner of war associations. They were reunions, and they would have, you know, parties and talk to them, but they didn't talk much about the war. You know, it was, I think, fairly commonly not done.
I think you mentioned this one briefly, but was your dad a POW prior to Stalag Luft III?
Yeah, oh yeah. He was in Barth, which was Stalag Luft I. And of course, when he didn't, when he was moved out of Stalag Luft III, he was moved to Bavaria, and then to Luckenwald. He got moved around quite a bit. And the long march, you know, that terrible march in the winter of 1945, when they marched them, the Germans marched them away from the oncoming Russian front, and it was very little food and very cold, and that took them to another prison. And eventually they were taken down to the Elbe and traded across the river by the Russians, who finally did catch up to the Germans, and they were traded for Russian prisoners with the Americans, and that's how they were liberated.
Right. Chris Knudsen wants to know, what was the time lapse between the time your father entered Luft III to the time the escape was conceptualized?
Well, they were always working. Hi, Chris. They were always working online on the tunnel in lieu of other tunnels, even before they got to Stalag Luft III. So work had been done in preparation. They'd captured. They've gotten some crystals to make up a radio that they kept track of the BBC. They couldn't transmit, but it was called the Canary, and they hid it in a medicine ball. But that came from other camps, and other tools came from other camps. So even before Stalag Luft III opened in the spring of 1943, preparation work had begun. And then from 43 to the fall of 43, when Tom was discovered, then they shut it down for a while in the fall of 43, and then started up strong in January of 44. And of course, the escape was made in 24th of March.
Right. I'll quickly mention this one. Patricia Kavanaugh says hello. Your parents lived around the corner from her grandparents, Alma and Herbert Brown, on Lakeside. She says she met your dad several times when she was a kid, and she was too shy to tell him he was my hero. She's read everything she could about the Great Escape, and she wanted you to know that.
Sure, she should have. Yeah, my parents lived at 3 Kingsbury Crescent for probably 20 years after they moved out of the beach.
Yeah. Peter would like to know if you have a copy of the large schematic drawing of the camp displayed as a memorial at the Toronto Radio Press Club.
No, I don't. I do have, you can maybe see behind me, a large schematic of Harry, of the tunnel. That's on the wall there. And that was prepared for one of these prisoner of war reunions. And I've got, I suppose, I don't know if you can see this. This is a mug made out of Klim cans, you know, that is sort of, this was of course a repro made for, again, for one of the reunions, but that's essentially the size of a Klim can. And they were used, of course, for the ducting and things like that. This particular one is made into a mug. I don't have one of the camp itself.
Great. Cindy says, how and when did your dad get back home?
A long and involved process, because they were so late, and I mean, it took them weeks to get down and get exchanged with the Americans. You know, long after D-Day, and even long after VE Day, they finally got back to England. But then, when they got to England, they were last in line for everybody trying to get ferried back to North America. All the troops, you know, so it took him a period of time. I'm not sure exactly how long. I think he was home by maybe early 46, I think, maybe. It took a lot longer than he wanted it to take. You know, I heard stories, again, kind of funny stories about how them deciding that they all got pissed one night, decided they're going to steal one of those Flying Fortress ships, you know, seaplanes and fly it back. Somebody thought they could do it. Generally speaking, when he finally got home, and of course, one of the problems was there wasn't very many jobs left anymore, and he had difficulty finding work. So he moved me and my mom back to England, where he'd met a lot of friends and a lot of POW friends, and he worked in England till probably my brother was born in 49 in London, and then we came back to Canada in maybe 1950 or 51.
Yeah. Terry Eckert sends a note that Colonel Jerry Sage was the POW portrayed by Steve McQueen.
That's right.
One of the characters, yeah. And he was known as the Cooler King.
Yeah, and he was an American, as I recall. But I think he disappeared into the South Compound at the same time that all the other Americans went. Certainly anybody who was in the American Air Force got moved out of the North Compound in September of 1943. Right. There were some Americans, you know, my godfather, George Harsh, was an American, but he'd been flying with the RCAF. So he of course stayed in the North Compound.
Yeah. Bill Ross sends us thanks for a fascinating presentation and says he's got some connections to the prisoners and would be interested in chatting with you about it. I assume we'll be sharing some contact info at the end.
Sure.
There's someone here named Claire Floody.
Say, I sort of recognize that name.
And she's asking if you could ask your dad one question about the escape today, what would it be?
If I had a question about it?
Yeah, to him.
To my father?
Yeah.
Gee, you know, there's lots of things I probably would have asked. You know, when I was sort of preparing for this talk, I reread the books that I'd read, you know, as an early teenager. And there was lots of little questions that I'm sure he could have clarified on that, you know, one of the ones that came up, I had a little web talk earlier today with Ted Barris and, you know, in World War II network a podcast. And one of the questions that constantly comes up is, if they were so good at estimating distances and things like that, how come Harry was short of the trees? And now that didn't really happen when my father was involved. He'd already been moved. But one of the answers given was the Germans are constantly cutting back the woods in various places. So it might have been possible that they cleared away part of it. And of course, you know, they were making the best estimates they could underground. It wasn't like they had a surveyor's gear or anything like that.
When we started admitting everybody into the presentation, you joked that it was all friends and family. Well, I'm beginning to think you were right. Dylan says, hi, Dad. Great presentation. And what was Wally's response to Sturgis's request for him to work on the movie?
Oh, he was happy to go, I think. Now, Paul Brickell had phoned him and asked him if he would go. So it wasn't a complete surprise to him when Sturgis called him. And he was happy to go. I think that you know, if Paul okayed it, he knew there was going to be a serious attempt to keep it authentic, or as authentic as it could be. And I think after, he was very pleased he went. He enjoyed the whole experience, and he enjoyed the whole element of movie making and that kind of stuff. I think he was proud of the movie, as well as he was proud of, not as much as, but as he was proud of The Great Escape itself.
Right. Terry Eckert sent along an added bit of information, very sad bit of information about the Kriegies who lost the wire. Apparently the Gestapo asked the electricians why the theft wasn't reported, and since they didn't report it, they were executed.
They're German. They were a work crew. Yeah, that's right. I'd read that relatively recently, and I think that upset everybody because, of course, after Tom was discovered, there was a whole big crackdown on anything that was involved in tunneling, and these guys were, you know, they were. I think they were maybe a Polish work crew that lost the wire, and they were killed.
Wow. More members of the clan are sending their congratulations, and they enjoyed learning some. Eileen and David.
Nice to hear from you guys.
Yeah, David says, John Weir credited your dad with saving his life by insisting he go for surgery to save his eyesight at the end of 43.
Well, Scruffy Weir, who you saw being interviewed briefly in one of those film clips, had his eyelids burned off when he crashed. So he had all kinds of trouble with his eyes, and they finally did manage to get him some kind of surgery to protect his eyes. But there was a horrible accident that he'd had, and it was part of his crash landing, you know.
Yeah. We've got the audience asking and answering their own questions here. What does CLIM stand for? And S. Green says it's milk backwards.
That's right. It's milk. They were cans of powdered milk, is what they were, and they spelled backwards on them. I don't know why, but they're certainly invaluable uses within the camp.
Yeah. Terry also sends along a note about Albert Bub Clark, who was the big S during the planning. And he was an American and wasn't involved in the actual escape.
Yeah, absolutely. He has a fairly famous book, I think 33 Months as a Prisoner of War or something like that, that he wrote after the war. And he was in charge of security for a while, and then George Harsh took over when he was moved with the other Americans to the South Compound in September of 1943.
Right. Apparently, he was involved for many years at the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs.
I think that's right.
Birgit is asking if there were any repercussions for the German guards after the escape.
I don't know about the guards, but certainly the commandant of the camp lost his job and was under threat of going to prison for it, and then sort of saved by the bell at the end of the war, if you can say that. And then I think his health was failing, and he was in the hospital at the end of the war, but he never did, he was never charged with anything, I don't think.
Right. Jules is asking another question about conditions in the camp. Was there much talk about breaking the Geneva Conventions, and you know, how much of a factor was that in the way the men were treated?
Well, generally speaking, the men were treated well. I mean, this was nothing like even an enlisted man's camp. This was an officer's camp, and it was run by the Luftwaffe, who saw them as kind of gentleman officers. You know, Goring had been an old pilot in World War I. And I mean, nobody was putting on weight with 1,000 calories a day, but they were fed. They had, and they were generally weren't put on work crews. They had the time to themselves between morning and evening appels. So it was generally, as far as prison camps go, an officer's camp was okay. It was, you know, when you got down into, after the escape, certain guys like Wings Day ended up in Buchenwald and places like that, which is a whole different story, you know. There was night and day really to a prison camp. I think that answered the question.
Yeah. Terry Eckert sends in along another pearl of added information. Colonel Jerry Sage was not an airman, he says. He was in the SAS under Sterling. So SAS is British Special Services.
Yeah. Who was he talking about, Colonel?
Jerry Sage.
Oh.
The Steve McQueen character, right?
Yeah, that could be. I'd never heard the Steve McQueen character linked to him. That might well have been.
Maybe that's my mistake.
I think I remember that discussion. I know that there were several script writers that worked on The Great Escape at one point or another. I think James Clavell being one of them, who wrote King Rat and Shogun and that kind of stuff. Who had some experience within Chengi in Japanese in the Pacific sector.
Right. Well, we're doing pretty good here. We're almost at the end of our time. We've only got a few questions left. Clyde says, thanks so much. He says, I'll never forget working in your house years ago, wondering who that older fellow was with all those famous actors.
Now you know.
A true Canadian hero. David is asking, how did your dad's POW experience affect his approach to life after the war?
Oh, it had a great effect, I think, especially because he was moved before the final escape, and therefore he probably lived as opposed to being killed as one of the 50, since he was one of the key personnel in the X organization. So he always thought, that every day was a new day because of that. He was, it started him off again, his life fresh. He had a pretty good attitude to life his whole life, and part of it came from the fact that the difficulties of the war had given him a second chance.
Yeah. Bill is asking a question which I think I know the answer to. He's asking, what does Luft mean in Luft III? Luft was what, the sky or the air?
Air. It was the air for the Air Force.
Yeah. So it was because it was an air camp. So it was a short form for Luftwaffe.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And it was run by officers
by the German Luftwaffe.
Right. Yeah. Can you tell us more about how Wally was captured?
He was shot down flying a Spitfire early in the war. It was his first, his first combat. He'd flown a couple of sorties along the French coast, but then they ran into like 100 Messerschmitts or something, he said. And he always just said he zigged when he should have zagged. Eventually he was shot down along with 4 or 5 others. It was a terrible day for the 401 Squadron. He parachuted into France, occupied France, and he always had back problems. One of the reasons he said was that he came down, he thought he was going to land on the edge of the roof of a barn, and he sort of put his feet out in front of him, and then all of a sudden a gust of wind took him off, and he landed right on his tailbone on the ground. And that he thought, at least, and he had issues with his back for a lot of his life. But he said a little woman ran out of the farmhouse and gave him this big tumbler full of brandy, which he quickly downed. And right behind her were a couple of German guards that had been following him down.
Wow. I don't know if you knew this, but 401 Squadron was originally called Number 1 Canadian Squadron.
I did know that. Yeah.
And they had to renumber because the Canadians were making such a fuss about being recognized as a significant contribution to the
not being in the RAF. That's right.
Yeah, and it was the same thing in the First War. The Canadians were quite overrepresented in the RAF and RFC. Terry also adds, POWs also had sensors of outgoing mail to make sure that nothing about the escape attempt was accidentally revealed. One POW wrote home, the Germans discovered one of our tunnels. Luckily, that letter was intercepted.
Certainly you couldn't write anything out that the senior British officer didn't see. And often, and I think Ted Barris's book talks a little bit about this, there was sort of a code that people would ask for. I think Scruffy Weir asked for in one 6-month period, 7 sets of silk pajamas, because that's what they were using to tunnel in.
Yeah.
And, but he would form it in the sense that these were getting torn up and worn out. And, they would say, would like to be home for Christmas. And really their wives could figure out. And there was a lot of even the 3 guys that got away, everybody had a fake name that they could use to send mail into the camp saying, oh, hello from so-and-so, which would let them know that they had made it back to England. So the 2 Norwegians and Bram the Dutchman had all written those letters back with prearranged fictitious names to transfer information that wouldn't have been let in otherwise.
Right. Bill Ross is asking, and I think I know the answer to this one because of 401 Squadron. Your dad was RCAF, right?
That's right.
Yeah. The Canadian, I've done a lot of research in this. The Canadians and the British were mixed up a lot in the various wings and groups and squadrons until Canada pushed to have their own group 6 group. So there were lots of Brits and Canadians mixed in all the outfits. Terry says, beside Davy Jones, there were 2 other flyers from Doolittle's Raiders in that camp.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah, Terry seems to know a lot. You guys got to get together. The secretary of the camp commandant moved to South Carolina after the war, and the last I ever heard is she still lives there. Wow.
He was American.
The secretary of the camp commandant.
Oh, the German.
Yeah.
Limits. Yeah, I don't know if he might have. Yeah, certainly some of them. There was some of the Germans showed up at reunions, ex-prisoner of war reunions, to great fanfare, especially in Great Britain. And some of them did move to North America. I'm not sure where. I know that the commandant himself, the one that was there for the Great Escape, I don't think he survived the war by more than a couple of years.
He might have got sent to the Russian front. And yeah, the secretary was a woman, so she lived there. Well, Glenn, I'm going to turn it back over to you. We've got 2 minutes left and we're out of questions, which is perfect timing.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Thank you very much, David. That was really great. And I do want to thank Brian for such a great presentation, something very interesting. I do have a couple of words from our sponsor, which I'm going to just put up on the screen here. So if you just bear with me, we will see a couple of slides and I have to choose the right one. This one here is the one I had before we started, and it has a few announcements, important announcements actually. We're always trying to get more members and have our current members to renew their membership for the current year. And we're also looking for people to become involved in the society and so on. And to get in touch and to speak with us and also to find out about upcoming events that we are organizing and sponsoring, please go to our website. While you're at our website, you should check it out because we have some fantastic historical information, local stories, especially how to research the history of your own house, whether you're in the neighborhood or not. So it's very useful for a lot of those things. And the website address is at the very bottom of the screen here. And there's my last slide, which is thank you for everybody for coming and listening to this great story. And of course, we want to thank our presenter, Brian Floody, and our technical help, David Fuller. And again, if you want to get involved with our organization or support us, please visit our website. And my name is Glenn Chadwick, and I'm going to sign off in a minute, but I'll just let Brian, if he's still there, have the last word. Brian.
Well, thanks for coming and watching, and thank you, Glenn, and thank you, David, and to my daughter Claire, who helped me with some of the video clips. Glad I could entertain you as long as I did, and thanks again.
Thanks, Brian. That was great. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Yeah.